Hi, everyone. My name is Alexis Matthews. I am a program officer at Serve Wisconsin. And thanks for joining in for this presentation, which is specifically about the AmeriCorps theory of change and logic model. I am going to ask Dr. Annalee Good and Dr. Nikki Bowman-Farrell to introduce themselves here, and then we'll get started.
Great. Thank you, Alexis. My name is Annalee Good, and I'm a researcher and evaluator at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research at UW-Madison, which is in the School of Ed. I co-direct the Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative there, which partners with Serve Wisconsin in providing evaluation support not only to the State Commission, but also to grantees and applicants, which is part of this partnership here.
Kolomosi, hello, this is Nikki Bowman. I want to do a special shout out to my colleagues of Coolness doing community work and other awesome associates. I am working with Serve Wisconsin and through the WEC Center with Dr. Good. I do scientific research and evaluation, specializing in culturally responsive evaluation. So hello and glad you're here.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and pull up the PowerPoint, and we will get started.
Great. So we're going to start today with talking through what a theory of change is, and then also a logic model. So the slide, please. The outline is to first talk about what a theory of change is. So talking about what the corporation, what CNCS and Serve Wisconsin define as that, and then also how to put one together. And then we'll move into logic models, and then some general tips and resources, including from the program officers that are part of Serve Wisconsin. Slide, please. And our goals, we have a couple. So one is that you leave this session with a solid understanding of what the expectations are in this grant application process for both a theory of change and a logic model. Also, we're going to really focus in on your awareness of how all these things align to one another, not only how elements within your theory of change and your logic model align to each other, but then also how these align to one another, including to your program narrative. And then also to highlight a couple of resources that, that are there for you to help build these things as you're working on your application. Okay, slide, please. So we'll have a couple different threads that we're pulling through today. One of which is that all of our work is happening in context and in cultural contexts in particular. So as a potential way, or there are many different ways of thinking about what culture is, but culture and context, one way to think about it is that they are dynamic systems of social values, cognitive codes, behavioral standards, worldviews, and beliefs that are used to give order and meaning to our lives, as well as to the lives of others. So how does that relate to what we're doing today? Is that when you are thinking about how you're going to design a program, and then how are you going to capture and describe that program in a theory of change and a logic model, you must think about the cultural contexts in which your program is going to be working and in which you are going to be working. And similarly, thinking about your own cultural identities and how those cultural identities impact your work, how you see the work, how you see also the context in which you're working. So this is a thread that we'll be pulling through, but to think very explicitly about this and to think and reflect as you go around the places in which culture is informing the way that you're understanding your work, yourself, and also the work, the communities that you're working with. Slide, please. So another thread that we're going to pull throughout today is alignment. And as writing an effective grant application, alignment is completely foundational and key to it. So there's going to be alignment between different elements of your program design. So your theory of change, logic models, and the actual narrative itself. And then a subsequent webinar recording is going to be on how do you build an evidence base that is aligned then to your program design. So again, thinking about that alignment throughout this whole process is key. Slide, thank you. So the first is we're going to think about is theory of change. Slide. So a couple different terms, and these are straight from the corporation's website. So it's important as you're talking about and you're writing your grant narrative is to use the language that the funder uses, because that's what they're going to be looking for. That's what the rubrics are set up on. That's what the reviewers are asked to think through. And so using this language is important because there's many, many, many different interpretations of what a theory of change is. But right now, focusing on the way that the funder interprets it is important. So the way that the corporation defines a theory of change is it's the underlying idea of how you believe your program will create change. In other words, you have in your mind what this program is and what you're hoping to do with it. And chances are people in your team also have in their minds what is your logic, what is your theory for what is going to happen. A theory of change is a way of getting that out of your brain and onto literally a page or a screen in a way that not only helps you to see whether it's aligned, but also for literally everyone in your team to be on the same page around that. Similarly, a logic model then is a next level of detail from your theory of change. So the logic model operationalizes or gets into more detail about what is kind of the 30,000 foot level of what the theory of change does. So a logic model then communicates more specifically how a program is going to work, and in particular by showing the relationships between different components. So we'll get to a logic model in a second. And then lastly, your program design is where you can really then flesh out all these other parts to talk about where the things like your goals, your activities, and your objectives and outcomes all come together in a program design. And your theory of change and logic models are really important parts of how competitive your application is going to be. And so on this slide, you can see what percentage of your points come from your description and your explanation of your theory of change and logic model. Okay, thank you. So again, alignment is everything. We're going to keep repeating that throughout here. So, and when I say alignment, I mean that you're being very purposeful around checking in yourself and making yourself accountable to what you've said your outcomes and your goals are when you think about what your resources are going to be and your activities. Okay, slide please. So in the RFP itself, the description of the theory of change, there's a number of different bullets. I'm not going to go through each of these specifically, but the point here is to look at this, is to definitely to take a close look before you start to write it up. Take a close look at what they are expecting from your theory of change. And then in whatever way you're going to do this to make it a functional workspace project management wise, these are the types of things out of the RFP to pull out and to put in as you're drafting. For example, if you're going to use a Google Doc, as you're drafting out your theory of change, cut and paste these bullets in as a comment at the top so that every time you can kind of look back and say, okay, am I keeping consistent with what the RFP is asking for? I'm going to pause. Dr. Bowman, do you have any things to add in around theory of change and working in the context of a particular RFP?
I just like the RFP and grant writing hack you just gave, which is, it sounds basic, but it's really missed quite a bit. All of these bullets become, think of it as Mad Libs, just like you said. In theory of change sometimes makes people nervous because, oh my goodness, we're talking about theories here. But really it's what you and your program have in mind to say, if we do X, then Y should happen, and then Z longer term will happen. And we're gonna sort of get into those slides next, but I really like one of the things, and I've been writing grants for almost 30 years successfully, not just writing, but winning, is that you take these and just make them like Mad Libs. The proposed intervention we are putting forward is blank. It responds to this, and this blank community problem. It's really that easy. And then you're obviously, you know, all of this will align to the other parts of the program design, the logic model, the application itself. So really good hack, cut and paste, very easy. And it's something that I personally do as well.
Great, thank you. I love the Mad Libs idea too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sensing a workbook that we could work on. Okay,
Yes.
Great, thank you. So slide please. So the components of a theory of change as the corporation defines it, and again, there's a lot of different ways that you can think about what a theory of change or a theory of action, those are often used synonymously, look like. This is the corporation's definition, and therefore if you're asking them for funding, you should use theirs. So again, as Dr. Bowman described, it's the underlying idea of what do you think is going on here? And the way that the corporation then asks you to define that is in 3 different chunks. First of all, what is the community problem or need? So we like to pause here for a second and think about this also from a culturally responsive lens, is that in a couple different ways. One is, who is defining what the problem or need is? Because oftentimes there are particular populations or particular groups, and depending on different power dynamics within communities, who get to define what the issue is, and then therefore the programs follow. And if there's not an alignment to actual community problem and need, because the voices of those in the community and that the voices of certain elements of community are not part of the process in actually defining the need, the whole thing gets messed up. So from a culturally responsive lens, this is key for you to do the work to get a representative voices from the community that you are partnering with around what the actual problem and need is. And similarly, sometimes it's not about a problem or need. Sometimes it's about this thriving, amazing effort that a group of youth and a youth worker came up with that just needs resources. They don't have a problem, they have an awesome solution that they're actively doing, that they need support and resources to then scale. And so one change or just one thing to contemplate as you're thinking about this is sometimes it's not as deficit as it's a problem or need. It's asset based. It's what is the community asset that needs resources and that needs support and networking. The middle part of your theory of change is, okay, what is the specific intervention, or what is the activity? What is it that you're doing? And we'll give an example in a second of this. But literally, is it a tutoring program? Is it a parks cleanup program? Like, what is the intervention that you're hoping is going to address that problem, need, or community asset? And then lastly, what is the intended outcome? What are you hoping the change is going to be? What is going to be the result of what's in the blue box right now, the specific intervention or activity? Another piece here to think about the cultural context is, and we'll talk about this when we talk about logic models too, is that the ways that different cultural groups or cultural histories or cultural traditions think about change, it is cultural, right? So the logic that somebody brings into understanding something is informed by culture. And so, for example, the fact that the arrows on this are only going in one direction, and or that it's boxes and arrows, reflect certain cultural frameworks or reflect certain histories that may not actually reflect the communities very well that you're working with. Granted, at the same time, you are asking for funding from an organization that defines it in this way. So there's a lot of going in between that obviously you need to do, and that's part of the work of writing an application in a particular context with particular, funding and constraints, et cetera. But we want, even though you're writing in this context, want you to also be reflective as you're thinking about your own space and the spaces in which you're working. Slide, please. So as an example of a theory of change, and again, this is straight from the corporation website. So this is an example that they're providing. If the problem or need is that families suffer from poor nutrition-related health problems, and the community has identified that this is a need, then a potential intervention or activity would be education and referral services. And when those education and referral services are in motion, we hope that then the outcome are healthier families. And that is the theory of change, that because of this, if we do this, it will end up in this. There are some resources linked below to some other kind of education around theories of change that are from the corporation itself. So if you feel like you need a little bit more on what a theory of change is, those are good places to go. So I'm going to pause for a second. Dr. Bowman, if you have anything to add in around a description of a theory of change, or how we do this in the context of cultural responsiveness too.
Other than, I like visuals that are used. So it's great to have those. And as Annalise said, we are writing to a specific organization. So using their language and the way they frame things is important. It doesn't mean that you can't add in contextualized information. I also think that when you are talking about problem and need, it's very good to have data so it's good to describe the problem or need, or if the need is this small intervention is working great and the need is we need to scale up, making sure that you quantify that in some way. One thing that I see as people are writing their theory of change, because this eventually goes in your application, is we talk story, which is important, but you have to balance it out with data. And so if you have data from after school programs, if you did a community needs assessment and you can show that there's diversity and representation, you know, by age, gender, orientation, it might be geographic, rural versus urban, whatever that might be, make sure that you cite and use what data that you have. And if you have local data, great. And if you can do local data in comparison to state or national data, especially if your data looks worse, it makes you look needier. So you have a strategy there. But just, you know, theory of change definitely is descriptive. But when it gets transferred and embedded within a program design and eventually your grant proposal narrative, it should be balanced out with words and with numbers, and breaking it up with these graphics also is nice. As somebody who's read thousands of done thousands of grant reviews, it's nice to have it in order and with a little bit of visual variety, if you will.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Slide, please. So the last couple of things we're just going to leave you with are just some resources. So there is a self-assessment for your theory of change that you can use, and the link is there. This is just a screenshot of one part of it. But it helps you, once you've written a draft, to go in and do some self-reflection on if you think you're hitting all the things that you need to. This is also a good opportunity if you have people on your team, or if you have a board member, or you have staff or somebody who wants to help in the grant application process. One of the things that they can do is to be your reviewer, you know, to be your internal reviewer. And so you can provide this type of assessment to them along with your draft, but don't tell them anything about it, so that then they're sitting down just as a reviewer would. All they have is what you've written and their rubric, and then give you feedback that way. Slide, please. So the last resource we'll share is, this is a screenshot from the actual website. And then, sorry, will you hit it again one more time? Thank you. So what is the arrow in there are some short courses, e-courses on this, which again, if you want some more to dig into, go for it. You can also see under planning and evaluation, all the different sections too. So you see logic models that then have a whole lot of different resources. And it's incredible how many resources are in the CNCS portfolio. Almost too many sometimes, which is why we try to pull out and link to some of them in particular that we think are helpful. But if you want to go down a rabbit hole of logic models, theories of change, and evaluation, this is your place. All right, Dr. Bowman, if you can take it from here for logic models.
Okay, I will. So if the theory of change is your story about what you hope is going to happen in terms of your programming, creating change, then the logic model is the story about your actual program, about the intervention. And so, next slide, please. So in just sort of blue collar scholar terms, as I like to say, because I know some of these technical words, theory of change or logic model, seem overwhelming. So I try to make it pretty concrete. You are actually describing your program and the things you put into your program and what you hope will happen in terms of, you know, short-term and long-term outputs or outcomes. And so you could tell a story about our after-school program does you know, we have food, we have volunteer bus drivers, we have academic support services. And, you know, when you say, tell me about your programming, this is the story you hear about what it is that you do. However, for a logic model and for a grant application narrative, you need to give the Cliff Notes version of your programming and what you hope the intended outcomes will be. And so you are going to see, and you can go to the next slide if you'd like to, because I can talk them through this. You are seeing the Cliff Notes, if you will, the squares at the bottom. So the inputs, this is right from our RFP. The inputs are the resources that you put into the activities and interventions so that you are able to support programming. And it may be hard dollars, it may be in kind, it may be people, materials, resources, just about anything. And then these are the resources that you need to have to deliver the intervention. And it could be the number of sites or locations. It could be the number of AmeriCorps members that will deliver the intervention. Anything related to the programming and the people and the resources to help get it done. And then in the middle, you see the activities, and these are the core activities that define your intervention or your model. So for the after school program, for instance, what are the things that you're going to be doing, the members what are they going to be doing to implement your program? So how long is the activity or the intervention? How often is it? What is the target population that you're serving? Those types of things. Outputs. Now, outputs and outcomes are a little bit different. The outputs are a direct result of delivering the intervention. So the number of people served, the number of people attending activities. If applicable, you can identify which national performance measures are going to be used as your output indicators. As an evaluator, which I love to be, I always like to keep the evaluation in mind all the time, not just at the end. So we have a national performance measures workbook, which you'll see a link to in the next PowerPoint. But what are the things that AmeriCorps is going to be asking you for to report on? So it's nice to know what are those outputs or outcomes you're reporting on, because that will sort of help. You won't have to have a blank piece of paper. You sort of see the list. And that kind of also helps guide you in developing a logic model. And especially if you're not doing it alone and you're doing it with a group of people, you can sort of talk about these lists and what makes the most sense in terms of outputs or outcomes. And you might as well figure out what your funder, if you're lucky enough to be funded, is going to be asking you for, so you sort of build that right in. And then outcomes demonstrate the changes in knowledge and skills, attitudes, or behaviors or conditions that recur as a result of the intervention. And again, the national performance measures from AmeriCorps are available to you. Sometimes short, medium, and long don't always mean in the next 6 months or in the next 5 years. Sometimes if you're working on especially hard topics, such as intergenerational poverty or intergenerational homelessness, or if you're helping folks who have trauma or other things going on in their life that are sort of getting in the way with them being healthy and contributing human beings in society, it might take a longer time. And the more outcomes you have doesn't mean the more amazing your program is. It's nice to have a very tight focus and understand both in terms of program design, your interventions, your outputs, and your outcomes to be very tight. You know, and it harkens you back to what is the community problem or need. Those statistics that you're trying to address should always line up with the activities and the outcomes that you are trying to, connect through your programming. I don't know if Dr. Good, do you have anything else do you want to add before we go to the next slide?
The only thing I would add is just, again, to think about how logic is a part of your own cultural identities and the cultural context in which you're working, and how we make sense of what logic is. And just, again, this is CNCS is a very particular way of asking you to fill in a logic model. So you don't have much flexibility at all about what sections make up a logic model, or how you're going to how you're going to put that in and populate it. But just as a note is that there are many, 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 many different ways of representing logic and modeling logic that do not always fit into boxes and arrows in a linear way. And so when you're doing other logic model work for your organization, is also thinking about what is the logic of the community context in which you are, and that's part of engaging voices across that context to understand what is logic, or in other ways, how are people making sense of this?
One thing that I've seen recently, and I, as somebody who has been doing logic models for 20, 25 years, I always like to see what's out there. And literally last week, the Atlanta area evaluation group had a logic model workshop. And it was really cool because it allowed youth and adults to draw a picture, draw a visual representation of what you think our theory of change is, or draw a visual representation, no words, of what you think our logic model of what our programming is. right? And what was really cool was not only to see all the different types of artwork, it was using a different part of your brain. And you know, it's very nonlinear in many ways when you do artwork, you know, trying to get at the points that Dr. Good was making. But it also allowed everybody in the room to sort of see and process everybody else's non-text logic model. And from there, then the person who was working to put a logic model together for an application can actually listen and use the visual representations and sort of build this more square logic model, because many of our funding sources ask for this more linear looking logic model. Together they build that, but it's based on pictures, lots of robust conversation and discussion of you know, members that were in the room that they invited in. So I think it's pretty cool. And again, this is just the big picture overview. The next slides are going to go into the separate little boxes, and we'll just really quickly go through those and talk about examples of what inputs and the rest are. So right, so here's inputs: human, financial, organizational, or community resources. It could be funding, staff, AmeriCorps members, volunteer training, research, in-kind space, you know, transportation, whichever. Okay, activities is next. These are the processes, tools, events, and actions that are used to bring out a program's intended changes or results. Now, I like to pause here, because if you have a room full of people and you're doing a program design session and you say, what are all of the things we want our program to do? Write one idea per Post-it note. All the activities, if you had no time issues, no money issues, no any issues, what would it be? Have them write one idea on each Post-it note, and then you can actually take these Post-it notes, these of activities, and you can start clustering them into groups. These groups then become either goals or objectives underneath the goals, of which you're going to be writing later in your proposal, and we'll talk about later in this PowerPoint. So hopefully that makes sense. So you see examples: workshops on healthy food, food preparation, counseling, referrals to food programs and resources. It might be training, you know, to especially now in COVID, you think about how do I grow my own garden? You know, how do I harvest from there? How do I preserve if I can't eat all of it? Lots of different things you could be doing. So then we go to outputs, and these are normally numbers, and they are especially for CNCS reporting. So as a direct result of your programming of the activities, what's going on with the target populations, who attended workshop, number of folks getting services, number of folks getting referrals, and so on. Okay, next slide. Outcomes. All outcomes are not created equal. They don't necessarily mean that they're on a time trajectory either, in terms of something you think may take a short amount of time actually takes much longer. And we certainly know that in the context of the pandemic. And so just really think about not only the expected changes that you're programming, that you hope your programming will happen with the population served, but this is, again, going back to what Dr. Good said, the community context really matters. What we think, what Nikki Bowman thinks in a room writing a grant in Shawano, Wisconsin, for, right now we're writing one for inner city Philadelphia clients of ours. I have no idea. So it's super important that you're talking to the people that live in the context. If the programming is for youth or young adults, making sure they're weighing in, because these conversations on the front end for the needs assessment, or even talking through or showing them what you're drafting up, will certainly help you have much more tight alignment, so that your program design and what you implement is going to have the intended you know, outcomes and impacts that you want, according to your logic model and your theory of change. So in, I guess, general terms, changes in knowledge, skills, or attitudes. So if you're teaching people how to plant seeds or grow their own gardens, you know, you can ask questions about those changes in knowledge, skills, or attitude. Medium term changes in behavior, if we stick with that, we can say, are we eating more decolonized food, or are we eating more homegrown food versus having to go to the grocery store because you're lowering your risk? I mean, that's, a lot of people are doing that now under the pandemic. And then long term, food security is a big deal. I just heard that this morning. Even with middle income communities, food security and having access to healthy food, or access to get to healthy food if you can't grow it, is certainly a condition. So long term, how do we see changes in their condition or status of life, you know, quality of life, social determinants of health, or whatever it might be. These are things that take much longer and frankly may not happen inside of the grant that you're writing. Annalee, any comments? We can go to outputs and outcomes slide, but any other comments about the main parts of a logic model?
Yeah, so the only thing I'll add in is that when you're developing and identifying what your performance measures might be, is that the way that the CNCS has performance measures is that they're basically coupled. There's an output and an outcome, and that they are aligned, or they are, you know, are connected. And in your logic model, then you need to think about, okay, where is that particular output? And then where is that particular outcome? And I would say for the most part, most of the outcomes that are performance measures in the list of the ones that the corporation provide tend to be more short-term outcomes, partly because they're more measurable. They're oftentimes more measurable, or just it's more feasible to measure it with what programs have access to. So, and we can talk about this when we look at the templates or the examples, but just know that it really helps your reviewer if you specifically call out in your logic model where your performance measures are, and you can just put the number, like ED whatever, or you know, whatever the little number is for the performance measure in the logic model, because then you've done the work for the reviewer of the alignment piece.
And this is just a final difference between outputs and outcomes, remembering that outputs are much short-term direct result of the program, often quantified, and then outcomes are resulting from a more short, medium, or longer term outside of the programming that result, you know, as a change of folks participating in your intervention and in your programming. And those changes can come as knowledge, attitude, behavior, life condition, and the sort. I can say that there are tons of logic model examples in the CNCS knowledge base, as well as instruments. So if you are looking to figure out how do we see changes in knowledge and attitudes about making healthy choices, you can literally look in the instrument knowledge base with CNCS. I would strongly encourage you to use that because it is chock full of a lot of information. And then again, going back to the culturally responsiveness in the context of things, you have to make sure that the outputs, outcomes, and even the instruments you're choosing to measure if there's changes make sense. You wouldn't ask, you know, somebody who's from an urban setting about, you know, big farmers markets and gardens, right? Unless you know there's farmers markets in town or that there's a dedicated community green space to the area. So really think about that cultural and community context of which your programming is in. Now we have a couple templates. The first one is really, like I told you, I'm a blue collar scholar, I'm basic. What does CNCS logic model template looks like? Because the reviewers follow this, and this is part of the rubric, the scoring rubric that Dr. Good talked about earlier. So this is how you're going to set up, these are your cliff notes. You're gonna put inside of here what your logic model is, and this is their template. And Serve Wisconsin said nothing has changed since the last application, so we're going with that. Here's our example of Food for All program, an example of a logic model. Apologize for it being so small, if it's small on your screen. And so you can see the inputs of what they're investing. They have local partners, funding, and nutrition education communities. So they sort of group their inputs. I like that. And then they group their activities. There's volunteering, there's curriculum development, they have training and trainers on there, either paid staff or volunteers. They're coordinating courses, and then they're coordinating the other Food for All related events. And then obviously promoting it, and then doing partnership development and outreach and maintaining those relationships to be sustainable are things that are important in this Food for All program. The outputs you can see line up with the activities and inputs, number of volunteers, courses held, Food for All related educational events, and so on, number of beneficiaries. I'm going to read a few more of these than I normally do when we're in class, because if folks can't get a video on, I want them to hear what we're saying. And I believe that there are going to be slides posted along with the recording on the website. I hope that's what's happening. And then you see the short, medium, and long-term outcomes. So it's a box a rectangular box, and it has these columns, and then they sort of organize them under short term, under increases in knowledge or skills or self-efficacy or improving attitudes. And some of those sub areas are increasing knowledge of where food management resources practices are, cooking techniques, increased skills in cooking, increased self-efficacy for I can do at-home meal prep. I can manage my food resources so things don't go rotten or so they stretch out amongst our long family. And then improved attitudes towards trying healthy foods or new foods or foods from the garden, making sure that all the dirt is off. Although I'm not mad at a carrot with a little dirt on because it reminds me of when I was little. Medium outcomes, you know, you're just seeing an increase in better meal planning, being able to compare prices, make grocery lists. Nutrition practices are focusing more on consumption by sodium, fat, healthy choices, sugar, whatever it might be. So you see more the medium-term outcomes that people not only are changing their knowledge, but their knowledge is getting deeper and a little bit more complex. And then in long-term, how do we improve food security? How do we increase families for eating healthy foods? Children have a healthy food environment that they are being nourished in. So those are more longer-term examples. Thank you. And then we have another example with the wildlife program, which, you know, we'll give you 10 seconds here to take a peek at, but.
And I believe that all of these are available on the website too, as, you know, things you can print off or, you know, engage with. So literally if you just Googled example, logic model, CNCS, it probably would pop up.
And you can do it by education logic model or nutrition ed or wildlife or whatever area that your programming is related to, because then it'll at least narrow it down even a bit more. And then to develop your own logic model, going left to right, it asks but how questions, and reading left to right, it uses if then statements. So if you do these inputs, then if you do these activities, then we expect these outputs, then we hope that these short, medium, and long-term outcomes happen. Annalie, did you want to say anything more about this slide?
No, I think we're good.
And then we end, of course, the way we always love to, self-assessing, give yourself time to write. That's another big deal. Look through, assess your logic model. Is the right level of detail there? Are you filling out the parts that CNCS wants? Does it seem plausible? Are you aligned with realistically with what your theory of change, the assumptions, you know, that you put forward in your theory of change? And then in terms of consensus, do you have staff and external stakeholders that agree that the model accurately depicts the program? Asking a program participant versus a program officer or a program staff member who implements, you know, the program officer might oversee, right, and do the admin part or the reporting. The program staff member might be implementing the program, and the program participant is the one who's coming to get services. All three of those have very different views on how what the program looks like, your logic model. So it's important to have that diversity that Dr. Good talked about, and making sure that you have time to check, you know, check and make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, so to speak. And then here's the page, CNCS, they're chocked full of logic model and evaluation resources. So you have to, on the landing page on the left, evaluation resources and training, it doesn't say logic models. You have to click the planning button, and then it takes you into another screen where you can see logic model sits under planning. All right, I'll hand it back over to Dr. Good.
Great, thank you. So we're going to just briefly talk about then program design and how you actually then, some tips on how do you describe all the things that we've just talked about, but in the narrative, in addition to then the theory of change and the logic model. So again, alignment is everything. So these are tips compiled by both the program officers at Serve Wisconsin and then from our team of evaluation support. So most of the tips on this slide are around alignment. So, well, and that first one is really key that Dr. Bowman just mentioned too, is giving yourself enough time. So for example, alignment, that the numbers themselves need to be aligned and consistent across all these different places in the application where you're going to be writing about them. So this is one thing that the reviewers will check for. So again, as a tip is when you're writing, if it's a number, just highlight it and keep it highlighted until your final version, so that you know that then that's something that you need to check back on, because those numbers might be dependent upon your budget, and your budget is constantly evolving as you're writing the application, and what are we going to be able to put towards this and put towards this, and that can impact your actual number of members, for example. So just keep yourself accountable to the review and the editing process, and make it easier for yourself to identify, okay, where are the places that we need to make sure that we're aligned. So using some detail on the actual dosage. So in other words, what amount of people getting of what. So the dosage is the way we talk about the amount. It's, for example, how many workshops with how many people, and how long are those workshops going to be? So give the reviewers some detail and some help in being able to imagine what it is that you've got in your mind. And then also making sure that the activities that your members are actually going to be doing is aligned to the program itself. Okay, slide please. Okay, some other tips specific to the logic model too. And again, there are particular limits within the application relative to the logic model. So for example, you have to keep it under 3 pages. As we mentioned earlier, embed the performance measures into the logic model themselves, so that it's a guidepost or roadmap for your reviewers. Not everything in the logic model has to be measured. So in other words, obviously the things that you identify as performance measures are going to be measured, but there might be things, especially in the long-term outcomes, for example. Long-term outcomes are notoriously really difficult to measure, especially in the scale of evaluation work that many AmeriCorps programs are able to do. And really make sure you understand the difference between outputs and outcomes, for example. That is really key, because that is a huge red flag, is if things are in the wrong box. Okay, we wanted to highlight the consideration and also the context that we're in Wisconsin, and that Wisconsin is the original home to a number of different indigenous communities and tribal nations, and that when you're thinking about the community that you're serving and the communities that you're partnering with, thinking about the tribes in Wisconsin is an important consideration, and that there are particular resources and focuses within AmeriCorps that also you can tap into. So if this is an area that you want some more information on, please feel free to reach out on this. There are some links here as well that on the national level, for you to understand what types of programs happen within the corporation. So there's actually an entirely separate funding stream that is directly from CNCS, focused on programming in tribal communities. So that, in addition to then we're in Wisconsin, and that Serve Wisconsin also with us also can support some of that work as well. So here's contact information for Dr. Bowman and myself, and also the WAC website, but we also encourage you to check, again, the CNCS resources, and let us know if you have questions as you're working on your good work. And thank you for all that you do and for your time.
Thank you both. This concludes this training, and we will have one more training with Dr. Good and Dr. Bowman, and that will be posted on the next link on our website.